Howdy, and welcome to the F1 Hatchet, and welcome to the Italy or Monza post-race reaction. What was your thoughts on this race? Were you excited that a non-McLaren win? Or were you bored because it was a Max domination of this track and didn't really foresee any kind of threat to his lead whatsoever in anything in this race occurred? I mean, there was that slight hint, potentially a safety car coming out, which would put a little bit more threat under Max Verstappen. But other than that, he was a really strong lead, really deserved going out there and just dominating this race. But it kind of led to a dull race, in my opinion. But what was your opinion? Just like normal, I go through the back of the pack and work my way to the front of the pack, going through each driver, telling you what happened to them if I know, and how well they did. I kind of give you some of my opinion on how they were working, how they drove this race. So we'll start off with Nico Hülkenberg, who started off in 12th and ended up in 20th with a DNF. He didn't even quite make it all the way to the start of the race. Going around in that formation lap, they kind of called him over the radio and said that he needed to retire the car immediately because of a hydraulic issue. And that kind of put him out really before the race started. Unfortunately, you could hear a little bit of a disappointment in his voice as they came on the radio. And he was like, really? You want me to retire the car right now before we even get started? And so it's a disappointment for Nico Hülkenberg, not even able to put any kind of race together for him in this race to see what he could have pulled out. And then we come to the other DNF, which is Fernando Alonso, who started off in 8th, ended up in 19th. And he had a suspension failure on lap 25, and you could see him running over the edge of those curbs a little bit, but shouldn't have done any damage to that suspension, but somehow that suspension had failed, and he had to pull into the pits and retire his car as well. And I know he was up there fairly up in the point range, and so I'm sure he was seriously disappointed in that. I think he was doing a good job before that, and I think he would have gotten up there at least in the decent points as well if he had continued and been able to not have that suspension failure. So a good job for him. Unfortunately for him, it's another failure in that Aston Martin that puts him at the back of the field without any points and without any even chance to really get points at all. And then ahead of him, it's his teammate, Lance Stroll, who started off in 16th and ended up in 18th. He had a one-stop strategy, stopping on lap 49, switching from a set of hards to a set of softs. Now, other than that, I haven't seen any kind of action for him. I kind of stayed at the back in that long pit strategy, going very long into the field and then switching to a set of softs. Didn't quite work out for Stroll in this running and ended up in the back of the field without any chance. I think they were hoping for a safety car where they could have taken advantage of that and then jumped up into the field and had some pretty good chance for good points. Other than that, I think he was kind of okay, it just didn't quite work out on the strategy front for them this time. And then we come to Franco Colapinto, who started off in 17th and ended up in 17th. He also had a one-stop strategy like everyone else, stopping on lap 33, switching from a set of mediums to a set of hards. And he passed Isaac Hydjar for 17th on lap 8. And he also had 3 track limit violations, so he would have gotten a penalty if he had had one more. So unfortunately for him, that didn't come to a pass. So he was just in that section and wasn't quite able to pull out where he needed to be and ended up in that same spot that he started off with. And his teammate was just ahead of him. Started off in 20th and ended up in 16th. He started from the pit lane due to some power unit elements changes that they did in Parc Ferme. So he started off in the pit lane. He did gain one spot at the very first lap. And he did a one-stop strategy, stopping on lap 49 and switching from a set of hards to a set of softs. He did pass Franco for 12th on lap 30. He did get a black and white flag for track limits on lap 36. So if he would have had one more track limit violations, he would have gotten a penalty. And he did pass Franco again for 16th on lap 52. Other than that, he was kind of a dull day. He did get up a little bit from that 20th position, so he did decently, but that Alpine was not quite where it needed to be on these low downforce, long, high-speed straights. So they kind of dropped back and weren't able to gain as much ground as they were hoping to. This gets us to Esteban Ocon, who started off in 15th and ended up 15th. He did gain one spot at the very first lap. he did a one-stop strategy, stopping on lap 52, switching from a set of hards to a set of softs. And he had a 5-second penalty for forcing Stroll off the track. So his day wasn't very good and ended up in that same 15th position. He was running up there at the front for a little while when on those the first set of tires that he was on, before having to drop back to the back after that pit stop late in the race. So unfortunately for him, he wasn't able to really take advantage of any of those situations to gain him a little bit more ground. I think he did an average job in this race, and kind of like a penalty for running Stroll off the track. I know he was claiming that it was too narrow at that point in time, so there's nothing that he could do. So we'll have to see if things change or if there's some different rulings in the future. But unfortunately for him, he got that 5-second penalty and it pushed him back a little bit further in that running. This is this to Liam Lawson, who started off in 18th and ended up in 14th. He did gain 3 spots at the very first lap, so he did a fairly good start, getting up there, getting by a few people on that first lap. He did a one-stop strategy, stopping on lap 9, so like the first person to stop, switching from a set of softs. So he was one of the few people to start on softs and switch to that set of hards. He did pass Yuki for 17th on lap 28. Other than that, he had a kind of a dull race, kind of staying in the back, not really be able to gain a whole lot of ground. Starting in the 18th spot, but gaining 4 positions, but not really a whole lot during the main part of the race. And his strategy didn't really help him in that regard. So unfortunately, he kind of got stuck in the backpack. I think he did an okay job, but just not quite enough of that car to really push him forward, unlike his teammate. So you have to compare that. He was kind of a little bit lacking compared to his teammate, as his teammate was able to get up through the field where he was not. This gets us to Yuki Tsunoda, who started off in 9th and ended up in 13th. He did a one-stop strategy, stopping on lap 19, switching from a set of mediums to a set of hards. He did pass Lawson for 17th on lap 27, then had to pass Lawson again for 17th on lap 28. So he had a really rough day on this track, could not get anything out of that Red Bull, and that's kind of a shame since his teammate was so dominant in front, so I'm not sure how that plays out in that Red Bull, but he was not able to get anything out of that Red Bull. So again, not a very good day for Yuki Tsunoda, and it didn't really look that good for Yuki Tsunoda as well in this running. We have Oliver Merriman, who started off in 11th and ended up in 12th. He had a one-stop strategy, stopping on lap 18, switching from a set of mediums to a set of hards. He did pass Yuki for 18th on lap 21 and passed Lawson for 16th on lap 25. And he had a 10-second penalty for causing a collision with Sainz on lap 41, where they ended up both spinning around, were able to recover and keep going, but that gave him that 10-second penalty, which dropped him back down into that 12th position out of the points. And unfortunately for him, kind of hurt him in that regard, as I know he was looking forward to try to get back up in the points, even though he said he didn't have a whole lot of top line speed and that straight line speed issues in that Haas. And that could kind of be played out in this running as well. And we come to Carlos Sainz, who started off in 13th and ended up in 11th. He gained 1 spot at the very first lap, and he had a one-stop strategy, stopping on lap 30, switching from a set of mediums to a set of hards. He did pass Behrman for 13th on lap 41, which they both had contact and were able to keep them going, even though they both spun around on the track and were able to go through. He also had 3 track limit violations, so if he had one more, he would have gotten a penalty as well for that track limits. Other than that, he had a pretty bad day in that regard. I know he was getting, swap positions with his teammate, and that he was really complaining about that a little bit. And he was, getting that contact, so dropping him back in the clutches, and really just was not having a very good day. I think Carlos needs to refocus and get some more setting. I think he expects him to be closer to his teammate, and things are not happening. So I'm not sure if it's just still trying to learn that Williams car, trying to figure out where that balance is and that tight window that they have to get those functioning correctly, or if there's something else going on with Carlos. But unfortunately, he's not looking good in the last couple of races. And this gets us to our top 10, where we find Isaac Haijar, who started off in 19th and ended up in that 10th and final point position. He started from the pit lane with power unit changes during Parc Fermé, so he had to start from the pit lane. He did gain 1 spot at the very first lap, and he did a one-stop strategy, stopping on lap 32, switching from a set of hards to a set of mediums. He did pass Franco Colapinto for 19th on lap 8, and then passed him again on lap 16 for 13th. He did a really good job, I think, coming in from the pits, getting those 9th places back into that 10th position, getting that last point. I know he was really disappointed in his qualifying session as he was just coming off that high and then was struggling to get back in the running and get some more points. So I think he did a really good job here, even though he didn't get quite as far up as he would have liked. But a really good job for Isaac Hijar, and a potential driver of the day, even though I would have still given it to Max Verstappen. This gets us to Kimi Antonelli, who started off in 6th and ended up in 9th. So he lost a couple of positions in the course of this race. And most of those were at the very beginning, where he's lost 4 positions on that very first lap. So he had a horrible start, trying to be a little too more cautious, I think, trying to pull him into this race, kind of dropping back. He did a one-stop strategy, stopping on lap 28, switching from a set of mediums to a set of hards. And he had a black and white flag for track limits on lap 30. And he passed Gasly for 10th on lap 40. And then he did the track limits violation again and got a 5-second penalty for driving erratically because of driving outside the track limits. And so that kind of cost him one spot, pushing him back into that 9th spot instead of the 8th that he was originally going for in that point. But still a loss from where he started. And I think he needs to just kind of calm down and kind of focus in and get some good runs together and concentrate on that run instead of trying to put too much pressure on himself and push him forward, as everybody's kind of expecting him to be the really good rookie. And it's turning out that he's just a regular rookie in this regard. He's in a good car and is able to do some good performances, but he just needs to settle down and a little focus in a little bit. So not the greatest run for Kimi Antonelli. This gets us to Gabriel Bortoleto, who started off in 7th and ended up in 8th. He did a one-stop strategy, stopping on lap 20, switching from a set of mediums to a set of hards. He did pass Lawson for 16th on lap 22, and he passed Gasly for 11th on lap 41. So a good run for him, even though he lost 1 position overall the race. I think in that Sauber car, he was doing a really good job getting up there, still getting into the points, and it's able to hold off some of those drivers and be able to maintain that position for the most part and get some really good points. So I think another good run for him. Yes, he could probably work on a little bit of things, but overall, since he's a rookie and kind of pushing himself in the kind of underwhelming car, I think he did a really good job. This gets us to Alexander Albon, who started off in 14th and ended up in 7th, so gained 7 positions over the course of the race. So he did a really good job there. He did gain one of those spots at the very first lap, and he did a one-stop strategy, stopping on lap 41, switching from a set of hards to a set of mediums. He did swap places with Sainz for 8th on lap 25, and passed Kimi Antonelli for 9th on lap 44. But again, I think Alexander Albon was doing a really good job in these last few races. Not quite qualifying where he wants to be, but able to make up that ground in the race. So if he can work on that qualifying a little bit better in that car, try to get a bump a little bit higher, I think he'll do a really good job and get some really decent points. But going all the way up to 7th and getting those points is really good for Williams. And if they can continue that, they will kind of solidify that position that they're in. This gets us to Lewis Hamilton, who started off in 10th and ended up in 6th. He had a 5-place grid penalty for passing under yellow in the last race. So that dropped him back, so he had to start off in that 10th instead of the 5th position. He did gain 2 spots the very first lap. He did stop once during this race on lap 38, switching from a set of mediums to a set of hards. And then he passed Alonso for 7th on lap 5, passed Bortoleto for 6th on lap 7, passed Stroll for 8th on lap 41, and passed Ocon for 6th on lap 42. So a really good race from Lewis, even though he had that penalty that dropped him back. I think he was able to maintain and get that ground early on where he needed it, and then he kind of stayed steady, sitting there behind his old teammate George Russell for most of this race. But still a really good job for, I think, for Lewis Hamilton to recover quite a decent number of places due to that penalty and still stick it out. I know it was kind of hard to pass in this race, and as well as some other issues. With that Ferrari, I think they did a really good job overall in that Ferrari. So I think he did a outstanding job. Of course, if he hadn't had that penalty, he may have been able to a little bit put more pressure on the front runners. That may have been a more of a spectacular event, but unfortunately, he had that penalty, which dropped him back. But then he could show kind of what he could do of making his way back through the field. Of course, this gets us to our top 5, where we find George Russell, who started off in 5th and ended up in 5th. He had a one-stop strategy, stopping on lap 27, switching from a set of mediums to a set of hards. He did pass Stroll for 8th on lap 35, and passed Ocon for 7th on lap 36. I know he was kind of complaining during qualifying session that they put him out on the soft tires instead of the medium tires, which he wanted, and that dropped him back into that 5th position. But it looked like pretty much that's where that Mercedes was going to be. They really couldn't make that much ground on the Ferraris. They were putting a little bit of pressure at the beginning, but not throughout this race, and kind of basically had a good steady race in that 5th position. Really good for Mercedes. I know they need to put a little bit more emphasis on some of those situations to see if they can get up and put more pressure on those front runners, but a really good job, I think, for George Russell to maintain that 5th position, and it's a pretty solid race for him. This gets us to Charles Leclerc, who started off in 4th and ended up in 4th. He had a one-stop, stopping on lap 33, switching from a set of mediums to a set of hards. He did pass Oscar for 3rd on lap 2, so he got up into the 2nd position for a while, and it was really good there and kind of put us on edge and figuring out how this was all going to play out and see if the Ferrari could, make his way up to the front, or if they were going to linger a little bit. And they ended up having to, lose that position, but they maintained that, 3rd position, that 4th position quite handily in that run. And so overall, I think Charles Leclerc did as best as he could in this situation, got himself into that position, tried to defend that position as much as he could, but that Ferrari wasn't quite there, and was able to have to relinquish that 3rd position and drop him back into that 4th position. So a good job for Charles Leclerc, even though it was his home race, and I know he wanted a little bit more out of this than he got. This gets us to Oscar Piastri, who started off in 3rd and ended up in 3rd. He had a one-stop strategy, stopping on late on lap 45, switching from a set of mediums to a set of softs. He did pass Leclerc, as I said, for that 3rd position on lap 6. So he kind of had a little bit of struggling at the very beginning, but was able to pull out and then get into that 3rd position and kind of maintain that 3rd position, with roughly the same gaps for the people in front of him for quite a way, and behind him a little bit. I think they had that 6-second gap for a while between all of those first 4 runners, and so that kind of solidified where they were in this race. They couldn't really put a lot of pressure on the people in front, but they were kind of doing well enough to keep them, ahead of the people that were behind them without too much issue. And then, of course, we had the big controversy over the situation with his teammate, where his teammate had a slow pit stop and then he lost the position. And so Oscar Piastri came out into that 2nd position after his teammate pitted, and then they decided to swap the position to quote unquote be fair in the situation, which kind of unsettles that situation. I really like, Lando, but in that kind of situation, unfortunately I would have probably just left it and let them fight on track. Looked like Lando may have been able to pass Oscar anyway, but it was hard to tell on this track. So maybe that was part of the conditioning that they were thinking of. I don't know, but they ended up, making that statement. And so now we're having to try to figure out how they're going to play out the rest of the season, whether they're going to start calling some team orders in the mix when they deem things that aren't quite equal. So that's the big controversy for this race, which is kind of weird. It puts a lot of, stress on those 2 drivers, I think, in this situation, trying to figure out, do they deserve to be in that 2nd, or do they deserve to be dropped down to the 3rd, or how that plays out in this running. I know it's not a whole lot of points comparatively from that 2nd to the 3rd position as it was from that 1st to that 2nd position, so that kind of plays into it as well. This gets us to Lando Norris, who started off in 2nd, ended up in 2nd. He did gain 1 spot at the very first lap. He did a one-stop strategy, stopping on lap 46, switching from a set of mediums to a set of softs. As I said, he had a really good start, got up alongside Max, made Max have to drive off the track, cutting the chicane, to maintain that first position. And then they came over the radio for Max to saying to give up that position because you'll get a penalty otherwise for that. So he ended up dropping back behind Lando. So that was a real good start for Lando to get up there and put some pressure and get up into that lead. Unfortunately, he was not able to maintain that lead. Max was able to, stick right behind him and then eventually pass him in that running, and then kind of stayed into that second position pretty handily through most of this race. And then, of course, had that bad pit stop, which dropped him back to that third, which then he had to swap positions through team orders to get into that second position so that they could, have be more equal ground in this flooding, which kind of, as I said, puts kind of a weird mix on things. And they did that on lap 49. So he had a 5.9 second pit stop, which is a kind of a horrible pit stop for that stop. And that really caused a lot of this to, controversy to, creep up in this running due to that mistake that the team did during that pit stop, and how that plays out for the drivers in the Drivers' Championship. We'll have to wait and see. But I think Lando did a really excellent job in this race, even though it doesn't quite lend it to him in this running. As I said, he was really aggressive when he needed to be, got in the first position. Of course, that McLaren wasn't quite there compared to that Red Bull and couldn't maintain that first position, but he was very steady and really good in second position over the course of this race. So I think Lando did a really excellent job getting most of everything he could out of that car. Unfortunately, there were some mistakes from the team and some other situations with Red Bull that led him into that second position. And then we come to the race winner, Max Verstappen, who started off in first and ended up in first. He did lose that one spot at the very first lap. I did a one-stop strategy, stopping on lap 37, switching from a set of mediums to a set of hards. He had to go off track to keep that lead. Then he dropped back behind Lando, again, because of team orders, because they saw how that came about, and they were just warning him to give that position up. But then he was able to pass Lando for that first position on lap 4. So it wasn't too terribly long before he got back into the first, and then he just kind of ran away with it from that point forward. And now I was thinking of having to check my calendar to see what year it was, because this reminded me of the old days of Max Verstappen just dominating the field and just running away with it without any kind of care in the world, just being calm, collected, and just kind of like having a joyride around this track. And it kind of showed in that regard as we look at the times. So I decided to put some of these time limits for the first to second gaps onto this new slide to see if that would be better for you instead of me just reading them out for you to hear. So if we go through this, we see on lap 5, there was a 1.02 second lead for Max over Lando. By lap 10, it was a 3.29 second lead for Max over Lando. By lap 15, it was up to a 4.27 second lead for Max over Lando. And then roughly the halfway point, not quite, but pretty close to that, lap 25, it was up to a 6.49 second lead for Max over Lando. And then we get him to the lap 35, which was a 5.52 second lead for Max over Lando. So Lando was coming back a little bit by that point. And then we had the lap change to pit stop strategies. So, and I put it on lap 44 instead of lap 45 because that's when Oscar pitted on lap 45. So that kind of made things kind of skewed a little bit there as well. So I kind of showed this on lap 44, which was a 3.71 second lead for Lando over Oscar, while Max had started to pit and came back out behind them into that third position. But we see by lap 50, it was a 19.5 second lead for Max over Lando. So a very significant lead at that point in time. And by the end, it was a little bit less, but still a very significant lead, probably 19.21 second lead for Max over Lando. Now here's a couple of different slides that you can see that kind of plays out. This is right before Max pit stopping. So you can kind of see those gaps there that Lando Norris was like a 4.72 second gap between him and Max, and Piastri was that 10.79 second gap. So you can kind of see that rough range there, those top three players. before, those pit stop strategies kind of occurred in that running. And then if we move forward, this is right before Oscar's pit stop. So we can see that gap between, Piastri and Lando was at 3.45 second lead. But we can see here that Max Verstappen had pit stop, and he was coming back very strong in this running. You can see that line, a steep slope. So he was coming up, going to meet them fairly significantly here in this run, where they were wearing out those medium tires. He was coming back up on that running on those new set of tires, and you could really tell the difference in that running. And then, of course, by the end, we kind of see here that we see Max Verstappen back in the lead, and we have that 19.21 or 23 second lead for over Lando, and then Oscar Piastri over there with that 21.22 second. So there's a smaller gap between Lando and Oscar, but still a fairly big gap in that running between that first position and that second position. And then you can kind of see where Charles Leclerc was coming in. Still a fairly big gap between them and that third position as well. But I figured that would give you a nice, good overview for some of this race. And if you like this, let me know, because I'll try to keep these in. Otherwise, I will kind of pull these back out, as these may not help you in visualizing this race and understanding how things played out. So what did this do to our driver standings? Well, we still see Oscar in the lead, of course, with 321 points over Lando's 293 points. We do see Isaac Hajjar jumping up to that 9th position over Nico Hulkenberg, now with 38 points. And we see Gabriel Bortoleto jump up to that 16th position, hopping over Oliver Behrman and Carlos Sainz, now with 18 points. So got a few changes there, but mostly it is a pretty steady through the road as we go. And for the constructor standings, we basically still see, of course, McLaren in the lead, jumping from that 584 points, so last week, to the 617 points. This time, not quite as big of a jump as we normally see with their 1-2s, but still adding more points to that constructor standing, pretty much solidifying that they will win that championship. We have Ferrari now with 280, and we have Mercedes with 260, so there's a 20-point gap there, and basically a 20-point gap between Red Bull and Mercedes at that point as well. So we'll have to see how that plays out in the next few races, as that could change over or get that switching around in those constructor standings. We have Williams pretty steadily in that 5th position with 86. And then what's interesting to see here is those Racing Bulls are now just 1 point behind the Aston Martins, with 61 over Aston Martin's 62 points. So we'll have to see if that can play out, or if Kick can still continue to get points and put more pressure on them, because they're only down like 6 points from that 7th position at the time. But a really good, interesting, development here, putting a little bit more, pressure on those teams to see if they can maintain those positions or gain some positions through the second half of this season. So if you made it this far, I'd appreciate a like and a subscribe. And if you would give a comment on whether those lap times were helpful or not, that would be great. But what we're coming up next, of course, we have Azerbaijan or Baku on September 21st. It was first introduced in 2016 and has a length of 3.73 miles with 51 laps being run for a total race distance of 190.17 miles. The lap record holder currently is Charles Leclerc in 2019, where he set that a 1 minute 43.009 seconds. So until then, I will see you on the grid, and farewell.